She was just 16, full of dreams, hope, and life. When she walked out of her Montreal home for a simple night with friends and vanished forever. For nearly half a century, her brutal murder haunted an entire community. A chilling reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight. But just when it seemed like justice would never come, a twist of science and fate shattered the silence. This is the story of Sharron Prior, the girl who never gave up her voice, even from the grave. It was March 29th, 1975, a crisp spring evening in Montreal's Pointe Saint-Charles neighborhood. 16-year-old Sharron Prior was getting ready to meet friends at a nearby pizzeria. She slipped on her favorite jacket, pulled her hair back neatly, and kissed her mother goodbye. The streets she had walked countless times suddenly seemed far more dangerous than anyone realized. The news shattered the tight-knit community of Pointe Saint-Charles. Fear replaced familiarity. Parents clutched their children tighter. Detectives quickly determined that Sharron had been abducted, likely forced into a vehicle. Tire tracks near the body hinted at a hurried escape. The innocence of an entire neighborhood was stolen that day. And for Sharron's family, life would never be the same again. Sharron's house was only a short walk from the pizzeria. No one could have imagined that a journey so familiar would end so tragically. Her mother, Yvonne, watched her from the doorway, a strange unease gripping her heart. A mother's instinct often knows what the mind refuses to accept. As night fell and Sharron failed to arrive at her destination, her friends grew worried. They waited, glancing nervously at the door every time it opened. Phone calls were made. Friends called friends. The realization slowly sank in. Sharron was missing by midnight. Her mother reported her disappearance to the police. But in 1975, missing teenagers were often assumed to be runaways. The police were slow to react, believing Sharron might have left voluntarily. But her family knew better. This was not like her. The next day, posters went up around the neighborhood. Volunteers scoured the streets, parks, and alleyways. There was no trace. 3 agonizing days later, a gruesome discovery was made. In a wooded area in Longueuil, across the St. Lawrence River, Sharron's lifeless body was found. She had been brutally assaulted, beaten, and suffocated. A man's t-shirt was tied around her wrists. Investigators combed through evidence, footprints, tire impressions, fibers, but forensic technology at the time was limited. Over 100 suspects were interviewed, profiles were drawn, composite sketches circulated, yet the killer remained a ghost. Leads grew cold, hopes dimmed, years turned into decades, and Sharron's case became one of Montreal's most haunting unsolved murders. But her family never stopped fighting. Year after year, they pushed for answers, refusing to let Sharron's memory fade. What no one could predict was that time and science would eventually catch the man responsible. As the seasons changed and years slipped by, Sharron Prior's murder remained a painful mystery, frozen in time. The police kept the case open, But with no DNA technology and no strong suspects, the investigation hit a dead end. Her mother and sisters held on to hope, attending every memorial, speaking to every reporter willing to listen. They refused to let Sharron's story be forgotten, even when the world around them seemed ready to move on. Detectives retired. Evidence grew dusty in archives. Witnesses grew older, memories faded, and silence deepened. Still, there were flashes of hope, anonymous tips, new suspects, but each lead eventually collapsed into disappointment. The pain never dulled. Sharron's bedroom was left untouched, a time capsule of her life, frozen at 16. Each year. On the anniversary of her death, the community gathered in her memory. They lit candles, said prayers, and promised they had not forgotten. In the 1990s, the emergence of DNA technology sparked a wave of hope. Maybe now, science could do what human efforts could not. Evidence from Sharron's case, the clothing, the t-shirt traces left on her body, was preserved carefully enough to test. But initial DNA comparisons yielded no matches. Her killer's profile was created, but remained nameless, faceless, out of reach. In 2014, Montreal police formed a cold case unit and Sharron's file was moved back to the front of the line. Forensic genealogists proposed a bold new idea, using familial DNA to find distant relatives and trace them back to the killer. It was a shot in the dark, but for Sharron's family, any chance, no matter how small, was worth pursuing. Detectives partnered with a lab in West Virginia specializing in cold case DNA analysis. Years of patience were about to pay off. In 2021, they found their first real break: partial matches to distant family members living in the United States. Building a family tree backward from those matches, investigators narrowed the search to a man with a dark past. Franklin Maywood Ramini, a convicted rapist who had once fled to Canada. A man who had lived frighteningly close to Sharron's home in 1975. Ramini had been dead for decades, buried in West Virginia. But suspicion alone was not enough. They needed proof. In May 2023, investigators got court permission to exhume Ramini's body. DNA was extracted and compared to the crime scene evidence. The results stunned everyone. A perfect match. After 48 long years, Sharron's killer finally had a name.
When the DNA results came back, confirming Franklin Ramini as Sharron Prior's killer, the room fell silent. Relief and heartbreak collided. For Sharron's family, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had come, but far too late for their beloved daughter and sister. Ramini had died in 1982, just 7 years after Sharron's murder, escaping earthly justice, but not the truth. Investigators revealed that Ramini had a violent past, including a rape conviction in West Virginia shortly before he fled to Canada. At the time of Sharron's death, Ramini lived only a few blocks away from her home. He walked the same streets, unnoticed. It was later discovered he had been a suspect in other attacks around Montreal, but nothing ever linked him solidly until now. The announcement of the case closure sent shockwaves through the Pointe-Saint-Jaloux community. Some cried, some simply stood in silence. For those who remembered 1975 vividly, the memories came flooding back. Fear, grief, the loss of innocence. At a press conference, Sharron's sister Doreen spoke through tears, saying, "We never gave up. We never stopped believing." She thanked the detectives, scientists, and all those who worked tirelessly to bring Sharron's story back into the light. Forensic genealogy, once a new and controversial method, had proven to be a lifeline for cases long thought unsolvable. The case became a powerful example of how determination and science can reach beyond death to find the truth. Sharron's memory was honored not just by her family, but by an entire generation of Montrealers who never forgot her. A permanent memorial was proposed in her neighborhood. A bench, a plaque, a small but powerful reminder of the life stolen. The solving of the case also reignited hope for hundreds of other cold cases across Canada and the United States. If Sharron could be given a voice after nearly 50 years, maybe others still waiting in silence could too. The case highlighted the resilience of a family that refused to let evil have the last word. It reminded everyone that behind every cold case file is a real person, a life interrupted, a story unfinished. For the Prior family, closure did not mean forgetting. It meant peace. The peace of knowing Sharron's spirit had finally been heard. And so, nearly half a century later, Sharron Prior's story ends not in silence, but in justice. A voice once silenced had finally spoken, louder than ever.
Right, let's jump into this. We're looking at March 29th, 1975. It's a crisp spring evening in Montreal in the Pointe St. Charles neighborhood.
Right.
And we have 16-year-old Sharron Prior just heading out, plans to meet friends, grab some pizza. Seems like the start of any normal weekend, doesn't it?
Totally normal. But as you dig into the details, I mean, it shifts so fast. Her mother, Yvonne, apparently had this really unsettling feeling when Sharron left the house.
Yeah, that detail right at the start just hangs there,
Yeah.
that maternal instinct.
It really does. That sort of premonition, maybe.
Yeah.
A feeling that something wasn't quite right. And tragically, she was spot on.
Exactly. So Sharron heads out, but she never makes it to the pizzeria. Her friends start calling, the worry starts building.
That slow, dawning realization that something is seriously wrong.
And what really stands out from the accounts back then is the initial police reaction. Missing teenager in 75. The immediate assumption was often runaway.
Yeah, it seems that was depressingly common. Maybe lack of resources or just a different societal outlook then. Underestimating the danger, perhaps.
It meant crucial time was lost, potentially. Because her family, they knew straight away. They insisted this wasn't Sharron. She wouldn't just disappear like that.
No, they were adamant. And that certainty really scared the community, didn't it?
It did. Almost immediately, you see posters going up, volunteers organizing searches. The whole neighborhood, Pointe St. Charles, is out looking, worried. A really powerful image of people coming together.
Absolutely, that immediate grassroots response.
But then, just 3 days later, the search ends in the worst possible way. Sharron's body is found over in Longueuil.
Yeah, and the details are just horrific. Assaulted, beaten. The cause of death was suffocation.
Yeah.
And that detail about her own T-shirt being used to tie her wrists, it's brutal.
It really paints a grim picture of the violence she endured.
And the impact on the community in St. Charles. It wasn't just grief for the family. It was this collective shock, a real loss of innocence, that feeling of safety just shattered overnight.
Definitely. The sense that something like this could happen right there, it changes a place.
It does. It leaves a lasting scar.
So the police investigation kicks off immediately. They're looking at footprints, tire tracks, fibers, standard procedure for the time.
Right. Using the tools they had back then. They interviewed, over 100 people? Developed profiles, composite sketches.
They were definitely working the case hard, putting in the hours.
But the sources make it clear, despite all that effort, the trail just went cold. No strong suspect emerged.
Yeah, it just hit a dead end. The technology just wasn't there yet, especially forensics. No DNA analysis back then, not like we have today.
Exactly. That lack of DNA capability was the major roadblock. They might have had physical clues, but linking them definitively to one person, almost impossible.
So the case just sort of sits there,
right,
unsolved. It becomes this haunting presence over Montreal for decades.
A real cold case in the truest sense.
But the one constant through all of this, and it really comes through in the accounts, is Sharron's family. Her mother, her sisters, they just never stopped fighting for answers.
Unbelievable resilience, year after year, decade after decade, keeping her story alive, pushing for leads, refusing to let her be forgotten.
It's incredibly powerful, that refusal to give up hope even when things looked completely bleak.
It really speaks to their love for Sharron and their determination to find justice, no matter how long it took.
So that brings us into this long period. One source calls it the long cold years. And it really felt like that, right?
Absolutely. Decades passed. The investigation was essentially inactive, stalled due to that lack of DNA technology and any real new leads. Time just stretched on.
You get that sense of the case being frozen, but the family wasn't frozen.
No, not at all. Sharon's mother, Yvonne, and her sisters, Doreen and Maureen, they were relentless, keeping her memory in the public eye, talking to the media, reminding everyone this wasn't just some old file.
Can you imagine the emotional toll, though, all that time?
It must have been immense. And the sources talk about these glimmers of hope that would pop up. An anonymous tip, maybe a new person of interest looked at.
Right, and then the disappointment when it leads nowhere again. That cycle of hope and letdown, over and over.
Just gut-wrenching. And then there's that detail, Sharon's bedroom, kept exactly as she left it. Untouched for all those years.
Oh, wow, that image. It's just so incredibly poignant, isn't it? A physical representation of time stopped, of that unresolved grief.
It really is. It speaks volumes about the hole her absence left and their inability to fully move on without answers. A constant, silent reminder.
Then things start to shift. The 1990s arrive, and with them, DNA technology starts becoming a real tool in investigations.
A massive turning point. Suddenly, there's this new wave of hope, not just for Sharon's case, but for cold cases everywhere. A scientific way to potentially find the truth.
And crucially, the evidence from 1975, particularly the semen found on Sharon's clothing, it had been preserved. That foresight was incredible.
Absolutely critical. Without that preserved evidence, even new technology wouldn't have helped. It shows how important meticulous evidence handling is, even before you know what future tech might bring.
So they develop a DNA profile from that evidence, a profile of her killer.
Yes, a huge step forward.
Right.
But there was another hurdle.
Right. They compared it to the existing criminal databases at the time, but no matches came up.
Exactly. So they had the killer's genetic fingerprint, but no name to attach to it. Another setback, in a way. Frustrating, I'm sure.
But still, having that profile was something, right? It kept the possibility alive that someday, somehow, a match could be found.
Definitely. It wasn't the immediate answer they hoped for, but it was a crucial piece of the puzzle waiting for the right connection. Science often works incrementally like that.
Okay, fast forward again. It's 2014 now, and the Montreal police, they establish a dedicated cold case unit.
A really important development, giving these old, complex cases renewed focus and resources.
And Sharon's case is one they revisit. And this is where things get, well, really interesting with the technology. Forensic genealogy comes into play.
Yeah, this is relatively new, but incredibly powerful stuff, using DNA in a different way.
Explain that a bit. It's not just matching crime scene DNA to a suspect in a database, is it?
No, not directly. It's more about using that crime scene DNA profile and comparing it against public genealogy databases like the ones people use to trace their ancestry.
Okay.
The goal is to find people in those databases who share segments of DNA with the unknown suspect. Not the suspect themselves usually, but maybe a second cousin, a third cousin, distant relatives.
And once you find those relatives,
then the hard work begins. You use traditional genealogy methods, building family trees, searching records to try and figure out how those relatives connect, and trace back, or sideways, to identify the likely source of the crime scene DNA. It's painstaking work.
wow. It sounds like detective work mixed with serious ancestry research.
That's a pretty good way to put it. And they partnered with a lab in West Virginia, I believe, that specialized in this.
And in Sharon's case, it worked. In 2021, they got a breakthrough.
They did. Partial matches popped up, linking the DNA profile to relatives, mostly in the United States.
So then came that painstaking process you described, building out the family tree, connecting the dots.
Exactly. Meticulously tracing those familial lines. And eventually that led them to one name, Franklin Maywood Ramin.
Franklin Maywood Ramin. And who was he?
Well, the investigation revealed he had a prior conviction for rape in West Virginia. And crucially, back in 1975, he was living very close to Sharon's home in Point St. Charles. He'd apparently fled to Canada sometime earlier.
Living close by.
Wow.
And he fit the timeline.
He did. It was a massive lead, generated entirely through this innovative DNA technique after decades of silence.
But a lead, even a strong one based on family DNA, isn't absolute proof, right? They needed confirmation.
Precisely. They needed a direct DNA comparison between Roman and the crime scene evidence. The problem was, Roman had died back in 1982.
So how do you get that confirmation?
Exhumation. In May 2023, authorities obtained permission to exhume Ronan's body.
Gosh, after all that time, you can only imagine the tension, the hope, the anxiety for the family.
Absolutely. Decades of waiting, potentially coming down to this final scientific test.
And the result?
A perfect match. The DNA from Roman's remains directly matched the DNA profile from the evidence found on Sharron's body back in 1975. After 48 years.
48 years. The science finally delivered the answer.
Undeniable confirmation. A testament to both the technology and the sheer persistence of everyone involved.
Which brings us to this feeling of, well, justice beyond the grave, as one source puts it. It's justice, yes, but it's complicated, isn't it?
It's deeply bittersweet. The family finally knows who is responsible. The case is officially closed. But Ramin himself died decades ago. He never faced trial for Sharron's murder.
Yeah, he escaped earthly justice. And learning more about him, that prior rape conviction in West Virginia, it just adds another layer of darkness.
It underscores that this wasn't an isolated act of violence, potentially. It highlights the importance of tracking repeat offenders, though obviously the systems were different then.
And the detail that he lived just blocks away from Sharron back in 75.
Showing.
And apparently he was even considered a suspect, maybe vaguely, in other attacks around that time. It makes you wonder.
It does. Hindsight is always 20/20, but it's a stark reminder of how close the perpetrator was all along, yet remained unidentified for so long.
When the police announced the case was closed, naming Ramin, you can imagine the reaction in Point St. Charles. Shock, relief, maybe? Closure, finally.
A huge moment for that community that lived with this shadow for nearly half a century, and for the family especially.
Sharron's sister, Doreen, her words were so powerful, quoted directly, "We never gave up, we never stopped believing."
That says it all, really. That unwavering belief, that refusal to let Sharron just become another statistic, it's incredibly moving.
And this case really highlights the power of forensic genealogy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's become a game changer for cold cases, offering real hope to so many other families who are still waiting for answers after decades. It's a powerful tool.
And there's talk now of a permanent memorial for Sharron in her old neighborhood.
Which feels like a really fitting tribute, a way for the community to remember her life, not just the tragedy, and to mark the end of this incredibly long journey.
So wrapping up this deep dive, what really stands out, I think, is that resilience, the family's sheer tenacity over almost 50 years.
That's definitely key. But also the incredible impact of scientific advancement coupled with that human determination. Neither could have solved this alone.
Yeah. And it's a reminder, isn't it, that every cold case file represents a real person, a life cut short, a family left waiting. Sharron's story, her voice, silence for so long, but finally heard.
Exactly. It's not about forgetting what happened, but perhaps finding some measure of peace, some closure. And it really makes you think, how many other stories like Sharron's are still out there, waiting for their own breakthrough, their own voices to finally be heard after all this time?